Can you guys see the screen? Can you let me know? Okay, great, cool. So today's lecture is basically some spillover from January. So a couple of topics that were spillovers from January that are very important, namely your commercial coal mining and trans fat regulation. And we'll be focusing on one of the largest topics of February 2021, which is the soft touch regulations on social media intermediaries and over the top platforms. Okay, so these are the three heavy topics that we'll be discussing in today's class. So it's probable that you can have some doubts. In case you have some doubts, please keep posting them in your chats, etc., because it's likely that you can have doubts in these topics. Okay. Um, so the first thing I want to discuss today is about commercial coal mining. So what recently happened is that the government said that to make sure that commercial coal mining is easier and it is profitable, they will open a single window clearance portal wherein your extraction or mining companies do not have to move from pillar to post, and they can get all sorts of regulatory approvals and your documentation, etc., run through one easy portal, right? So they want to increase the ease of doing business for coal mining. So while this happened, another interesting that happened was that for the first time in India's history, coal blocks have been auctioned for commercial use. Now I'll tell you why this is for the first time in India's history, because up until now, earlier in 1970s, your coal mining, like many of the other things, were nationalized, and after that a lot of your private entities weren't used to commercially mine these coal mines, right? So either you had Coal India Limited, which could mine um dude, I don't even, so Ishwarya, I don't even use LinkedIn, man. Like, you can send me a request, but I don't use it. You can, like, probably Instagram or Facebook. I don't use LinkedIn at all. Okay. um so anyways, so, so basically, up until now, the regime was that you can only have captive mining, or you can only have Coal India, which does mining for specific purpose. You couldn't have mining for commercial purposes, as in you could mine and sell the coal, right? Now, this thing has changed from January 2020. Now, let's look at that. So, before we proceed, let's look at the coal sector in India and why do we actually need commercial mining, and let's try to understand the sort of coal resources that we have. Okay. Now, in spite of the fact that India has the fifth largest global coal reserves, we still are the second largest importer of coal. So it doesn't make a lot of sense. Okay. Just say, for example, in the year 2018-19, we imported about 235 million tons of coal, primarily from South Africa, Australia, Russia, and Indonesia. Okay. Now we imported 235. We domestically produce about 730 million tons, out of which about 80 to 85% is coming from Coal India Limited, which is a public sector enterprise, and it is not extremely efficient like most other PSUs. Okay. Now, why coal is important for India? Because if you look at the sort of energy that we generate, you have your hydel power projects, you have your solar power, wind power, all of those, nuclear power, etc. But still 72 to 73% of the electricity that is generated in India comes out of your thermal power plants, or through which basically burns coal for energy generation. Okay. Now, if you have a general idea about India, you should know that the general distribution of coal is in Jharkhand, Odisha, Chhattisgarh, West Bengal, Telangana, Maharashtra, and Madhya Pradesh. Okay. Now, if we have to focus on the specific types of coal in India, so why I'm discussing this is because captive mining and commercial mining in coal was a big piece of news in January 2021, because this is the first time that we've had captive mining and commercial, non-captive commercial mining. So therefore, there could be articles wherein they expect you to know each and everything about this coal infrastructure in India and the availability of coal resources in India. So these things become really important, and these are the small fill in the blank type things that can be asked. Okay. Now, if you look at the sort of coal reserves that we have in India, they are of primary two types, lignite and bituminous. So if you've done basic science, I think 6th, 7th, 8th, May, this is taught generally. So you have four kinds of coal: lignite, bituminous, peat, and anthracite, out of which only lignite and bituminous sort of coals are available in India. Now, lignite and bituminous are not very good quality of coal, and therefore they have low calorific value and high ash content. Calorific value means the amount of energy that is generated if you burn 1 unit of this coal, right? So therefore, the calorific value is low, but at the same time, it's highly polluting. So long story short, Indian coal is not of such good quality. Okay. Now we've looked at the general coal infrastructure, availability, and types of coal that we have in India. Let's try to look at the sort of regulatory framework which governs coal. Okay. Now coal, like any other, like a lot of other things, is basically minerals. Okay. So let's try to understand the regulatory framework around minerals in general and then coal in specific. So if there is a mineral resource within the boundary of a particular state government, then that state owns that mineral resource. If this mineral resource lies in the ocean or territorial waters or the exclusive economic zone of India, then the ownership right is with the center. So if it's outside the geographical boundaries of a state, then it lies with the center. Otherwise, if it is located within the Indian landmass, then it is obviously owned by the state. Obviously, if there is some coal in any union territory, that will automatically be owned by the center. Okay. So if you look at the distribution of powers in India, you have the seventh schedule in the constitution, which has your three lists: state list, center list, union list, state list, and concurrent list. So it basically delineates the sectors and delineates the sector wherein either the center government or the state government can make specific laws and regulate. Now, according to the seventh schedule, both center and state laws can be used to govern coal, can be used to govern mining. Okay, the mining industry as such. So, therefore, in light of that, Parliament in 1957 passed an act known as the Legislation of Mines and Minerals Development and Regulation Act, or the MMDR Act. Now, this governs all minerals in India except petroleum and natural gas. So, there is another act for regulation of petroleum and natural gas. So you should know that the important thing that you need to know here is that the MMDR applies to all minerals except petroleum and natural gas. Okay. Now, under the MMDR Act, there are two classification of minerals. On one side, you have minor minerals, and on the other side, you have major minerals. Okay. Now, mining of all minor minerals and generally control over illegal mining of both major and minor minerals is completely vested with the state government. So to mine minor minerals, state government don't need any central regulatory approval, and generally the responsibility to prevent the illegal mining of any mineral, whether major or mineral, lies with the state government. Okay. Now, apart from this, the Central Union Ministry of Mines notifies something known as the minor minerals. So as of today, there are 55 naturally occurring minerals which have been classified as minor minerals. Okay. Now, minor minerals, as I told you, are absolutely within the domain of the state government. State government kuch bhi kar sakta hai for mining of minor minerals. Okay. Now, in case of major minerals, still most, because as I told you, right, the states basically own minerals which lie within the boundaries. So in case of your major minerals as well, substantially the control vests with the state government. However, there are certain approvals and certain provisions that they have to adhere to. Jaise, for example, in the case of coal and atomic minerals, if the state government is going to grant some sort of a concession, it has to take the approval of the central government. So these are small little things that they have to take approval for. Otherwise, substantially the control is with the state government. Okay. Now, let's say if some sort of royalty, etc., has to be revised or new royalty has to be fixed vis-a-vis any mineral, then that power to fix and revise the royalty also lies with the central government and not with the state government. So, apart from giving concessions and fixing royalties for major minerals, everything to do with major minerals lies with the state governments. Okay. I hope there is no doubt here. Now, this is the overarching infrastructure that you have to basically know. Okay. So primarily what we've understood is, though there is a central MMDR Act, most of the control vis-a-vis both minor minerals with absolute control of the state government, vis-a-vis major minerals also majority and a substantial control lies with the government. Okay. Now, if you look at the history of mining in India, more specifically the history of coal mining, there was an act in 1973 known as the Coal Mining Nationalization Act. According to this act, all the coal mines in the country was taken from the private sector and it was given to the government of India, as in it owned a company known as Coal India Limited, and Coal India Limited got ownership and mining rights of all the coal mines in the country. Now, this happened because when the coal mines before 1973 were in the private sector, the conditions of the labor over there and their safety requirements, etc., were completely being ignored. Now, to protect the laborers involved in the coal mining sector, the government said that the private sector is prioritizing only profit and they are unable to take care of this labor class which is employed in these coal mines. Therefore, the government decided to nationalize all the coal mines. Okay. Now, as we understand, in 1993, after the balance of payment crisis, India generally faced, and in 1991 India generally opened up, and this is known as liberalization, right? So in 1993, 2 years after liberalization, the act was amended, and now captive mining was allowed by both private companies and public sector undertakings. So basically, captive mining means, let's say I am a power, steel, or a cement or an aluminum company. I can bid for a mine. The government will give me a license for this mine. However, I can only use the coal from this mine from my personal activities. Let's say I am Tata Steel. Now, I obviously need a lot of coal. So I will bid for coal mines. Then I will extract a lot of coal from these mines. But I can't sell this coal to any other company. I can't sell this coal in the open market. I can only use this coal for the purpose of Tata Steel, right? So this process wherein you can only use the coal that you have mined for your personal use is known as captive mining. Okay. So the captive mining regime started in 1993. However, in 2014, the Supreme Court said that these allocations under the captive mining regime were most likely arbitrary and it smelled some form of corruption there. So therefore, the Supreme Court cancelled all the licenses that were given, right? So therefore, a new regime had to emerge to provide for licensing. Okay, so therefore, in 2015, the Coal Mines Special Provisions Act 2015 was passed, which allowed for captive coal mining through an auction process. So before this, there was no auction process. You could just apply for a license to the government. If the government liked you for whatever reason, they would give the license to you. So this, the Supreme Court said, is obviously wrong. So in from 2015 to 2020, you could bid for captive coal mining based on an auction. Now, Tata Steel, JSW Steel, and any other company whichever wants to take out or mine the coal from that particular mine would now compete with each other, and they would try to get that mine in an auction. Okay. Now, in the years between 2015 to 2020, it was realized that a lot of companies were generally not interested, and they thought that it is easier for them to actually import a lot of coal because they are spending way too much money in coal mining, and the coal is also not of a very good quality, right? As we've discussed. So the government of India in 2020 enacted an act known as the Mineral Laws Amendment Act. So this basically amends the 1973 Coal Mining Nationalization Act, and it also amends the MMDR Act of 1957. So under this act, captive coal mining regime has now ended, and it has now cleared the path for commercial coal mining, right? So after this act, now these companies, I mean, not particularly these companies, any company can now actually bid for a coal mine, and any coal that this company extracts from this coal mine can be used for whatever purpose it likes. It can sell this coal in the open market. Now, this is the new regime that has started from 2020. So captive mining has come to an end, and now you will have commercial mining. So इसी का first tranche है that was recently operationalized. Okay. Now let's look at the new regime in a little more detail. Abhi tak you generally studied about the history of coal mining in India. Now let's look more particularly at the new regime that we are seeing. Okay. Now, as I told you, all the end use restrictions are gone. आपने जो करना है उसको लेकर आप करो, and therefore private sector is allowed to commercially come in and use and mine. Now, no previous mining experience is required for participating in bidding. Actually, I can form a company today. You can form a company today. It can be an absolutely new company. We can go to the government and say, okay, we are bidding for this coal mine. So we'll give them some money. Abhi uske baad, if I can mine coal, if I can't mine coal, if I can profitably mine coal, is not the government's problem. It is my own problem. I am going to give a fee and I am going to bid for that particular mine. Okay. Now, since commercialization is allowed, 100% FDI is now allowed through the automatic route. So FDI is foreign direct investment, right? So let's say a company invests in another company in India, not generally in the stocks of that company, but makes a direct investment into that company with the intention of setting up a business enterprise in India. That is known as a foreign direct investment. Generally, there are two routes of foreign direct investment. Either you come through the automatic route, so the government regulates and marks out certain sectors for which you don't need a government approval. If you want to enter into a business in India with any other company, you can. There are certain sectors that are reserved for approval. So let's say if I as an entity want to provide or enter into India through the FDI regime for certain specific sectors, I might have to take some sort of regulatory approvals. Now, for coal mining, you don't need any regulatory approval, and the FDI is through the automatic route. आपको पैसा डालना है, आप डालो, कोई सवाल नहीं पूछा जाएगा, ठीक है? Now, another very interesting thing is that the revenue that you have to share with the government, right, will now not be fixed. It will be on an ad valorem basis. Basically, it means जितना आप coal mine करोगे, extract करोगे, uska hi certain percentage you have to share with the government. Now, the benefit to these companies is, let's say there is an event like the coronavirus pandemic. So obviously the demand for coal would have been reduced because in the lockdown, not a lot of industries were running. So let's say if the private companies had to pay a fixed amount of money to the government, then those companies would probably incur huge losses. But right now, what is happening is, because there is no production under the new regime, if there is no production in the coronavirus pandemic, there is no fixed amount of money that you have to give the government. If your production is zero, then you give 0 rupees to the government. So therefore, it softens the blows for these companies and acts like an incentive for companies that want to enter into the commercial coal mining sector in India at a long-term basis. Okay. Now, under the new regime, the government has very clearly said that you can also extract any other minerals that you find here. So let's say the government auctions a coal mine or suddenly वहाँ सोना या diamond निकल गया. Now you don't have to apply for a separate license. वो आपकी किस्मत है. If you find gold there, if you find diamond there, you can continue extracting it. There is no problem. Okay. Then another thing is that the Ministry of Coal now says that we want the private sector to come in because obviously the government wants to utilize the money that it has in other endeavors. Healthcare mein use karna chahte hain. Maybe to construct highways, they want to use that money. They don't want to use money and pay Coal India Limited for commercial coal mining, right? So they are saying that they want the private sector step in. And if the private sector does decide to step in, the government itself is saying that we will help you with getting all sorts of statutory approvals and environmental approvals. And this is the reason for which the single window clearance has been set up that I discussed at the very beginning of this slide. Okay. Now let's try to look at the benefits of the new regime. ये आपको सवाल नहीं आएगा generally, but this is something that you should know, right? Because this is more of a subjective thing, but you should generally have an idea because these figures that I mentioned here are a little important. So first obvious thing is that India, as I told you, in spite of being the fifth largest, having the fifth largest reserves of coal, is still the second largest importer of coal. Now, if you are able to ramp up production or mining of coal domestically, then obviously we can save a lot of money in our import bill, right? So as of now, we are spending about 1 lakh crore rupees to import coal. We can substantially reduce this import bill by a good 30 to 40,000 crore rupees. Now, another benefit is that so till you didn't have commercial mining, you only had Coal India Limited, and you had certain private companies which were mining coal for their particular use. So therefore, the coal sector wasn't modernized. A lot of new technology was not being used because एक तो competition or competition ही नहीं था. Coal India Limited had no competitor, and the other companies didn't have much of an incentive because they themselves were going to use that coal, right? So right now there will be competitors to Coal India Limited, and At the same time, these other companies, these erstwhile Tata Steel, JSW Steel, etc., all these companies would now have the added benefit of mining, using for their own use, and selling into the market, right? So it is most likely that these companies will invest more money, they will make coal mining more efficient in order to maximize their profits. अब साथ ही साथ में earlier on, the states didn't get any sort of revenue, right? Because royalties were meant for the center. So all the royalties would go to the center, and that was fixed, right? So irrespective of how much coal you were producing, you had a fixed royalty. Now it is very interesting. Once you remove, as in once you allow companies to produce as much coal as possible, as long as the market is consuming it, it is predicted that most likely it will lead to an increase in the production or mining of coal. Now, with this increase in the production and in the extraction and mining of coal, it is predicted that because now the revenue is not a fixed amount, it is based on an ad valorem basis. So it depends on how much coal is extracted. The revenue that the states would generate would increase by 7,000 crore rupees per annum. So these are a few benefits that we can see from this new regime. So I'm going to take like a 30-second break. Is there someone who has a question or anything? I hope I have comprehensively explained this. इसमें और कुछ as such बचा नहीं है out of this topic that can be asked. Okay. Now, let's look at the next interesting topic. It is about trans fat. So, apart from the fact that it is important from your examination point of view, I think it's important for your life as well. Be close. Okay. So, FSSAI has now put a cap on the amount of trans fats that can be present in food items. So, first, let's try to understand what trans fats are. Okay. So, trans fats or trans fatty acids are basically unsaturated fatty acids that can come from either natural sources like your cows and sheep, or from industrial sources wherein hydrogen is added to vegetable oil, therefore making it a solid at room temperature. Okay? So this results in partially hydrogenated oil. Now let me differentiate between saturated and unsaturated fatty acids. Okay, so basically saturated fatty acids are those fatty acids which have only single bonds. Unsaturated fatty acids are those fatty acids that have at least one double bond between two carbon atoms. Okay. Now, this is the difference between a saturated um, fatty acid and an unsaturated fatty acid, right? So, the unsaturated fatty acid, which is basically additional, which basically contains one, at least one double bond, is generally not considered to be very good. Okay. Now, industrially, trans fats are found in your hardened vegetable fats such as margarine and ghee. So, jo bhi solid, so any fat that you generally see as solid at room temperature, that happens because additional hydrogen has been added to that fat, and therefore it solidifies at room temperature. So, solid fats are not generally good. Now, your snacks, baked goods, and fried foods generally contain a lot of these unsaturated fats. Now, they are used since they have a longer shelf life and they are cheaper than other fats. So, the primary point of dipping something in fat and oil is to make sure that you can preserve it for longer. Now, in preserving also, while you have the option of preserving it in saturated fatty acids or unsaturated fatty acids, if you use trans fats, then the shelf life of that product increases and it is much cheaper to produce trans fats as opposed to other high quality fats. Okay. Now, generally, your trans fats are unhealthier compared to your regular fats because your trans fats increase bad cholesterol, which is also known as LDL or low density lipoproteins, and it lowers the good cholesterol, that is high density lipoproteins. So, guys, you should know that not all cholesterol is bad. There are two types of cholesterol: good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. Trans fatty acids से bad cholesterol का concentration बढ़ता है as opposed to good cholesterol. Okay. Now, the harmful effects are manifold, right? So even let's say if you increase the number of calories that you take per day from trans fatty acids by 2%, it increases the risk of a heart attack by 23%. So the impact is just too much. And it's only recently that people have started realizing how harmful your trans fats can be. For example, we are going through the coronavirus pandemic, right? We are saying that a lot of people are dying. Yes, it's true, a lot of people are dying. It's a very sad thing. But it's been estimated that globally every year about 5.5 to 6 lakh people die because of trans fatty acids. This is a global number. And if you come to India, at least 60 to 65,000 deaths every year are as a result of long-term consumption of trans fats and trans fatty acids, right? So therefore, the FSSAI has come in and said that we need to reduce the amount of trans fats that we have in our foods by a large extent, right? So before we proceed further and understand what the FSSAI has said, let's try to understand what the FSSAI exactly is. So the Food Safety and Standard Authority of India was established under the Food Safety and Standards Act of 2006. So isse pehle there were multiple, let's say, organizations, there were multiple acts and multiple orders of different ministries which had guidelines related to food and health issues, and these were issued by multiple ministries. Now, after the 2006 Act, what happened was, one second. So right after the 2000, this act basically removed all the other orders, etc., and they consolidated the regulation of all food related issues with the Food Safety and Standard Authority of India. Okay, so therefore let's look at the key things that FSSAI does. So they set standards for food production, etc. They develop all sorts of safe food practices. They give licenses to food businesses, ensure that they comply with these licenses through inspection, etc. They randomly test food to ensure that these standards are being met, and they train and build capacity. And they also have a citizen outreach in the sense that they inform citizens about their rights, and they inform citizens about the bad things that exist in the market and that they shouldn't be consuming. Okay. Now, the overall control of the Food Safety and Standard Authority of India lies with the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. Okay. Now, let's look at the history of trans fat regulation. Okay. So, December 2020, FSSAI had said that we are capping TFAs in oil to about 3% for 2021, 2% by the end of 2020. Okay. And by the end of 2022, and the permissible limit as of December was 5%. Now, after that, FSSAI came up and said that, boss, no, this is too slow. They issued a revised guideline wherein they said that now any food product that is using edible oils or fats as an ingredient will not contain industrial TFAs which are more than 2% by mass. And this they are implementing from 1st January onwards, right? So earlier on, they had said that they would limit it to 2000 to 2% by 2022 end, which means by the beginning of 2023. So therefore, they are preponing this target by 1 year. Now, this also coincides with the campaign that is launched by the World Health Organization known as Replace. Now, the idea behind the Replace campaign is to make sure that you completely eliminate artificial trans fats from the global food supply, because every year 5 to 6 lakh people are dying because of overconsumption of trans fatty acids. And most people don't even understand, and most people don't even know that trans fatty acids are a huge health hazard. Okay. Now, FSSAI has done a good job, and they are trying to eliminate all industrial products which industrially produced TFAs in India. And they are doing it 1 year ahead of the global target, which is given by the WHO, right? So this is something that you should know, that the WHO is running a program known as Replace, and the target is 2023. However, the Indian target is by the beginning of 2022. Okay. Now, for the FSSAI to meet such a stringent target, they have started 3 initiatives. So the first initiative, where they inform the citizenry in general, is the Eat Right movement. So they basically broadcast over radio, over all sorts of social media, etc., YouTube, etc., and they try to work on the two pillars of eat healthy and eat safe. Okay. Now the primary aim is to cut down on salt and sugar consumption by around 30% in 3 years by educating the customers. Give me like 15-20 seconds. I have an urgent call to take. Hello. हाँ जी सर, आप किधर है? अच्छा, आप वहीं पे रहना, तो मैं शुरू करता हूँ। Yeah, hi guys. Sorry for that interruption. Anyways, so as I discussed, FSSAI has launched three initiatives. The first is the Eat Right movement. Basically, they're educating people to eat well. Then, as a follow-up, you have the heart attack rewind campaign. So every day, basically, radio pe, YouTube pe, Facebook pe, etc. FSSAI is trying to educate people about the risk of heart attacks if they continue the consumption of trans fatty acids. Okay. Now, the third thing that FSSAI is doing now is they are saying that if there is any food making manufacturing company or an establishment that basically produces any fatty food, etc. And if they don't have industrial trans fat above a threshold, which is zero point 0.2 grams per 100 grams of food, then they can display this healthy trans fat free logo at their outlets and on their food products, right? So if you see this logo on food products, then you know that ye kha ke aapko generally heart attack ka risk nahi aayega, right? So these are three things that the FSSAI has been doing. Okay. Now let's look at the major challenges that exist to eliminating TFAs. पहला, लोगों को पता ही नहीं है. Most likely, most of the people watching this video had no idea what trans fatty acids are and how they are posing an ever increasing risk to heart attacks. So this is a first challenge. आप खुद सोचो, did you know about this? Now, second is that let's say there are small menus. So if you put this policy on, let's say, Frito Lays or something, they have the sort of money to remove trans fatty acids. They will replace trans fatty acids with other acids because the consumption of their goods is also fast. They probably don't need that much of a shelf life, right? But if you have small domestic manufacturers of all these snacks, उनके लिए थोड़ा मुश्किल हो जाता है because the cost of production will be very high for them. Plus, the goods that they produce don't sell out that fast, so they need some sort of a longer shelf life as compared to your renowned international brand like Lay's, etc. The third problem is that technologically there are, you don't have any other fats that exist which can do the same job at the same price. So recently, one replacement that has come around is the PUFAs or polyunsaturated fatty acids. But वही है, the production of PUFAs is much harder and much more expensive than TFAs, right? So basically, small enterprises को इसमें काफी loss हो सकता है because the cost of compliance with these guidelines will be much higher for them. Okay. Now, the third and this large topic that I want to discuss with you is the Information Technology Intermediary Guidelines and Digital Media Ethics Code Rules 2021. Now, these rules were notified in February 2021. एक महीना roughly अखबार में every day there was at least one opinion about these rules. Okay, so therefore it is very important for us to look at the subject matter of these rules in great depth. Like, it's a very easy and a very likely question that can be asked from here because it has a lot of objective type question. It has a lot of data that can manifest itself in objective type questions in your exam. Okay. Now, before we proceed as to how these rules came about and why these rules are needed, let's try to understand why these rules came up. And the judiciary had a fairly important role to play in this. Okay. So in December 2018, the Supreme Court had taken a suo motu writ petition. मतलब अपने आप से किसी ने बोला नहीं था ऐसा Supreme Court को. So this case came to be known as the Prajwala case, right? So mostly what happens is Supreme Court में you take an appeal and then you take a writ, as in you file for petition in the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court decides whether to accept that petition or not. But a suo motu writ petition is when the Supreme Court looks at something that is happening ordinarily in the society and realizes that कोई हमें writ petition नहीं डाल रहा, but we think that we should give our 2 cents on this and we should regulate this. So therefore, Supreme Court will say that, okay, we will take suo motu cognizance. जैसे for example, recently, if you've been following the news, a lot of cases and writ petitions were filed in multiple high courts across the country against the central government for its inability to provide adequate amounts of oxygen. So the Supreme Court, in its own goodwill and great judgment decided, it's better that the Supreme Court takes the suo motu cognizance and transfers all these cases from the High Court to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court reserves this sort of a power, right? So coming back to the original background here, December 2018, the Supreme Court decided that there are a lot of cases of child pornography, a lot of rape videos are being circulated, and a lot of these videos are being hosted on random websites and social media platforms. Okay, so the Supreme Court gave a direction to the government and said that why don't you frame necessarily guidelines which help to tackle this problem? There needs to be a law or at least a rule which gives the executive the power to deal with instances of child pornography, rape videos, etc. That had become very common in India, right? So after the Supreme Court gave this direction in the Prajwala case, the Ministry of Information Technology, also known as METI, it prepared a draft information technology intermediary guidelines rules 2018. Now, these rules were to replace the earlier rules that were passed in 2011, which were obviously not up to the mark, right? So, 2018 mein, these rules are also replaced. However, in 2020, another very interesting thing happened. This Tandav, not Tandav, yeah, this Amazon show called Tandav, this show called Tandav was released on Amazon Prime, and certain sections of the society felt that that either Lord Ram or Lord Shiva, I'm not familiar with what happened in the show itself, I haven't watched it, but certain people had objections as to they had objections with how their gods were being depicted. So there was someone who filed a PIL or a public interest litigation in the Supreme Court, which said that, boss, we need to regulate these OTT platforms. Okay, OTT platforms are basically those platforms that are not telecasted on TV, etc. You just need an internet connection or to be able to access this, right? So therefore, they are not as regulated as your normal cable channels or the channels that you have on Dish TV, etc. Right? So there weren't a lot of regulations for this. इसीलिए somebody had filed a PIL in October 2020, and they said that, boss, you need to regulate these OTT platforms because they are displaying vulgarity, they are harming sentiments of people, they are against public morality, etc. So all those standard sets of arguments were given. Okay. Now, after listening to this PIL, the Supreme Court in 2020 said, okay, as in it directed the your center to do something, and then it asked the center, "Aap kar kya rahe ho? What is the response to this?" Now, as a response, 1 month later, the central government bought the OTT platforms and news and current affairs content under the ambit of the Information and Broadcasting Ministry, right? Earlier on, this was not under any ministry. The Information and Broadcasting Ministry was only regulating your radio and TV, cable news, etc. So now it said that all the OTT platforms and the current affairs content which was being shown by a lot of these YouTube channels, etc., would now be subjected to the Information and Broadcasting Ministry. So 2021 May, then in February 2021, Supreme Court issued a notice to central government and asked it to create a proper board or some sort of a management organization to regulate all these OTT streaming and media platforms. Now, as a result to this, the Supreme Court, the center formed the Information Technology Rules 2021 under the power that the central government has under Section 87, subclause 2 of the Information Technology Act. Okay. Now, before we proceed and try to understand what are the provisions of these rules, let's try to understand why these rules are necessary. Okay. Pehla, user base बहुत बड़ा हो गया. So in the Indian OTT market will reach about 237 billion rupees by financial year 25, or 2019 mein it's only 42 billion. So we are going to see a 5-6 fold increase. Now, obviously, if there is such a huge market, you have to regulate that market. Like, it's but obvious that some form of regulation will come in. Now, another thing is, before this sort of regulation or an iron hand came out from the center, it's not that the government had not given adequate time to these OTT content providers. The government had basically said that you develop your own internal mechanism to tackle any form of objectionable and illegal or inappropriate content, and try to devise a mechanism whereby the government doesn't have to interfere. आप self censorship से ही regulate कर लो. But this was very incompetent. These companies also probably didn't take it seriously. and that didn't happen. Say, for example, the Internet and Mobile Association of India, they gave a self-regulatory mechanism, which the Information and Broadcasting Ministry outrightly rejected, citing issues like conflict of interest, lack of independent third-party monitoring, no code of ethics, etc. Right? So this सेल्फ रेगुलेटरी मैकेनिज्म दैट दे हैड बेसिकली सेड दैट हम ही अपने कंटेंट को रेगुलेट करेंगे और अगर किसी को प्रॉब्लम है तो वो अपील भी हम ही खुद देखेंगे. नाउ ऑब्वियसली देयर इज एन ऑब्वियस कॉन्फ्लिक्ट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट हियर, राइट? लाइक आई कांट बी द जज इन माय ओन केस. अगर मैंने किसी का मर्डर किया है तो उस केस की हियरिंग मैं खुद से नहीं कर सकता. इट इज फेयरली ऑब्वियस, राइट? So on these grounds, the Information Broadcasting Ministry said that we've given you time. You wasted a lot of time. Therefore, we as the government will have to step in and form certain rules because the industry itself failed. Okay. Now, obviously, one of the factors that led to this was ensuring the safety and dignity of women. So a lot of your revenge porn, rape videos, morphed images and photos of women were being circulated online, and these were obviously outraging the modesty of women. So therefore, the government had to step in and said, "Boss, aapse nahi ho raha, we will come in." Coupled with this, there was a problem of fake news and misinformation, right? So India, for the last few years, 6, 7 years, a lot of fake news is generated. Now, this comes from all people, like every political party, every entity that probably exists in India is generating its own set of fake news. So now it's become very tough to ascertain what exactly is the news or not. And the sort of fake news that can be generated can have dangerous effects. For example, recently you would have seen that there were a lot of rumors of child kidnapping that were floating around. So, for example, let's say if I had to implicate someone, I'd probably make a video of a couple of people and try to circulate that video in a village by saying that these people will come to your village. These are child lifters. ये बच्चे kidnap कर रहे हैं. Now, obviously, लोग थोड़े भोले भाले होते हैं गांव में ज़्यादा, and these people, so a lot of people were actually killed and lynched by the mobs on these random rumors that were being spread. So to prevent this sort of fake news and misinformation from being spread, you have to have certain regulations, and the central government has to step in. Okay. Now, further, obviously, a lot of democratic institutions. So this is a little problematic because a lot of criticism was being levied against a lot of institutions like the Election Commission, the Supreme Court, etc. People all over the social media was bashing them for not doing the job correctly. So this sort of means that you're sort of criticizing the democratic institutions, which ideally should happen in a democracy, right? Criticism is the first thing that should be guaranteed in a democracy. But हो सकता था that there could be certain challenges to the legitimacy of these democratic institutions. Therefore, the government decided that it is better to shield them from criticism to ensure that लोगों की नजर में legitimacy कम ना हो जाए. Because if these institutions lose legitimacy, then that's a bigger problem as far as the government is concerned, right? So this is a little problematic, but all the other reasons are good enough reasons to have these sort of stringent rules and regulations. Okay. Now, so let's look at the provisions that exist for social media intermediaries. So there are two provisions. Pehla provision hai for social media intermediaries. Then there is another set of provision for your current affairs and news media online and OTT platforms. तो पहले हम social media intermediaries पे क्या provisions है वो देख लेते हैं. So the first provision is that the social media intermediaries have to do their own due diligence, which basically means that there are certain minimum things that the social media intermediaries have to do, like retaining any information that has ever been provided for 180 days. If there is a cyber security incident or a breach in firewall or security breach, then they have to mandatorily report it to the government. They can't hide such a breach, right? So if it is found that any social media intermediary is not doing due diligence like this, then it will not have the protection of safe harbor provision. So under section 79 of the Information Technology Act, there is a provision known as safe harbor provision. Safe harbor provision basically says that social media is a platform, right? So it can't possibly regulate all content that there is at the platform. तो हो सकता है कि कोई व्यक्ति or some person or some entity makes an objectionable post on that social media platform. Now obviously it is the responsibility of the social media that when it comes to its of the intermediary, that when it comes to its notice that some form of objectionable content has been posted, then it will take adequate action and probably remove that content, right? But you can't punish the social media intermediary for someone else posting on that platform, right? Because उसमें उसका कोई control नहीं है. Obviously, if that content has been there for a while and people have complained about that content, and then the social media intermediary is not following up and doing proper due diligence, then obviously the safe harbor provisions won't be available. But randomly, अगर कोई बेवकूफ इंसान कोई objectionable content post कर रहा है, you can't possibly hold the social media intermediaries liable for it. Okay. Now, the second provision which pertains to social media intermediaries is grievance redressal mechanism. So it says that all social media companies have to appoint a grievance officer who has to deal with the complaints and share, and the companies have to share publicly the name and contact of such officer, right? So let's say Facebook will have to appoint a grievance of a redressal officer, Instagram, Snapchat, all of these social media platforms, TikTok, etc. If it comes back, they will have to appoint an officer in India, and uska number, email, etc. has to be provided publicly so that people can complain. Now, the primary job of this officer is to acknowledge the complaint. Let's say I file a complaint today. Within 24 hours, this guy has to tell me and acknowledge the complaint. He has to tell me that, sir, I have received your complaint and I am going to take adequate action. And he's bound to take reasonably adequate action within 15 days. If he doesn't do that, then there are punishments, etc. for him. Now, so now there is a more stringent requirement vis-a-vis ensuring safety and dignity of users, especially women users, right? So let's say there is an objectionable content or a nude photo or a video, etc., that is being circulated, and this you file a complaint with this grievance officer. Now, within 24 hours, for ordinary complaints, he's supposed to just reply and say, I have looked at it, 15 din mein main action le lunga. But if there is some content which is derogatory to the dignity of a woman, then that content has to be compulsorily done away with within the 24 hours, right? So there is an extra obligation vis-a-vis content which is derogatory to the dignity and modesty of women. Okay. Now, another very interesting thing is that it has introduced two categories of social media intermediaries. One is your regular social media intermediary, and the second is significant social media intermediary, right? So significant social media intermediary means a social media intermediary जिसकी एक threshold है. Now this threshold has been set by the central government as 50 lakh registered users. So if there are more than 50 lakh registered users, then that social media intermediary would be considered to be a significant social media intermediary. अगर आपके 50 लाख से कम registered user हैं, then you will be a छोटू मोटू social media intermediary. Now, obviously, there are stricter and more stringent compliance mechanisms for significant social media intermediaries. ये इसीलिए किया गया है कि अगर छोटा एक social media platform is trying to come up and it has only 4-5 lakh followers, then obviously it doesn't have enough money to comply with all of these stringent requirements. But let's say a platform that crosses 50 lakh registered users, then it is able to generate enough money through ads, revenues, etc., to be able to ensure compliance with these norms. Okay, so there are additional due diligence requirements that have to be followed by this significant social media intermediary. So this is the threshold you should remember. 50 lakhs. Okay, so if you have more than 50 lakh registered users, then you automatically become an SSMI, and therefore there are greater obligations on you. Okay. Now, so they have to appoint a chief compliance officer, जिसका basically काम होगा कि Information Technology Act और rules को के साथ comply करना. Then they have to appoint a nodal contact person, जिसके साथ law enforcement agencies 24/7 रात को 2-3 बजे भी phone करके coordinate कर सकती हैं for any sort of an emergency. And you have to obviously have a grievance redressal officer. Now, all of these people must live and reside in India. ये बाहर किसी foreigner को appoint नहीं कर सकते. So Facebook, for example, has to make sure that these 3 posts are occupied by people. This could be an Indian or a non-Indian, it doesn't matter. But that person has to be resident in India. उसका physical presence India में जरूरी है, citizenship कहीं की भी हो. Okay. Now, on top of that, these companies have to publish a monthly compliance report that this is what we have done over the month and these are the actions that we've taken to comply with the directives that are given by the government. Okay. Now, if you are a significant social media intermediary, then you have to identify the first originator of the information. So let's say मैंने एक rumor फैला दिया that ये लोग हैं, ये बच्चे किडनैप कर रहे हैं या ये गाय का मांस खाते हैं in a communally sensitive area. So obviously वहां पे law and order problem हो सकता है. It can be a danger to the lives of those particular people and to the people in general around, right? So if you are a significant social media intermediary, which means आपके 50 लाख से ज्यादा registered users हैं, then you have to have an extra obligation to be able to trace the originator of a content. तो अगर मैंने ये कंटेंट शुरू किया है और मैंने फैलाया है और ये फेक कंटेंट है, then I obviously deserve to be punished, right? So now the obligation is on the SSMIs to make sure that they can track the first originator of any message. आगे कितनी बार forward हुआ है, that doesn't matter. They will now be able to track this at source. So जो malicious elements in society हैं who are making these sort of stupid fake messages, these people now will be punished because now there is an extra obligation to trace the originator of the message. तो इससे fake news काफी हद तक curb या control हो सकती है. Okay. Then there are 3 other things. I'm sorry, but these guidelines are very dense और इस पे 1-2 महीना सिर्फ अखबार में यही आया. So it's very likely that you will have a question on this. Okay. Now, there is also a voluntary user verification mechanism. So if I am a user and I wish to verify my account on any social media, then I should be able to verify it. फिर नाम के सामने take क्या कुछ आ जाएगा, which basically means that I am a verified user account. वो use करने वाला मैं ही हूँ. They will take some sort of ID, etc. Okay. Now, the thing is, if there is, let's say, if the social media SSMIs, they decide to remove certain content, like let's say I put up some post on social media and the significant social media intermediary believes that that post has to be removed, then I have the right to have an opportunity to be heard. तो वो मुझे notice भेजेंगे कि sir आपने एक objectionable content post किया, we want to remove that content, and if I can justify as to why that content should exist and continue to exist, then it will be there. But mostly कोई ऐसा करता नहीं है. If Facebook is blocking my comment, I'm honestly not going to care enough to just actually have an opportunity to be heard, talk to 5 people and allow them to and give them permission to post a status for me. Okay. Now इसमें problem एक ये हो सकती है that I put up something which is criticizing the government and the government gives an order to this Facebook etc कि भाई हम. Now they can't obviously impine on my free speech directly, but they can give a feeler to Facebook कि देखो हटा दो नहीं तो life में problem create कर देंगे. Now in this sort of a circumstance, Facebook can basically say that bro, we don't want to take that much risk, so therefore we will not allow you to post any criticism of the government, right? So this is an example. Just recently during the pandemic, oxygen shortage is there, right? There's no denying that there is no oxygen shortage. Now certain directions have been issued by certain governments in the country to Twitter, asking them to take down posts which are criticizing the government's approach to the pandemic. So this is the sort of problem that can arise out of these rules. So iska misuse ho sakta hai. So this is a sort of concern that I will also highlight in the next slide. Okay. Furthermore, if there is a provision for removal of unlawful information. So let's say there is any information which is detrimental to the interest of India or public order, or it affects friendly relations with other countries, the concerned appropriate government officer or its agency can then send a notification to the significant social media intermediary, and these guys can then subsequently delete that particular provision, right? So this power is being provided by these significant social media intermediaries. Just hold on. Now, one of the concerns is something that I discussed with you. Let's look at So let's look at the other concerns that exist. So the first concern is that because the social media intermediaries now have to trace the originator of the message, they have to keep more data with them for 180 days, etc. There is an obvious chance that there will be an increased surveillance by private entities like Facebook, etc., and by the state entities, right? And this will obviously be a threat to the privacy of the users. Okay. Now, these encrypted messaging apps like WhatsApp, Telegram, etc., will now have to collect more data, which defeats the purpose of them being encrypted messaging apps in the first place. So obviously this information can be misused by both the platforms and the government, right? It's not that the government is always nice. Sometimes people in the government might want to misuse the sort of information or data that they have on you. Okay. Now, artificial intelligence is also not that intelligent as of now. So a lot of these regulation is going to be done by artificial intelligence. And like, how do you train artificial intelligence to actually make optimum decisions every time? So itne level pe to artificial intelligence exist hi nahi karta. We don't have that sufficient or developed artificial intelligence, right? Now, then self censorship is another issue. So the government says that if you don't do adequate due diligence, we will remove the safe harbor provision, which means that the government can punish that social media intermediary for some form of information or comment, etc., or a status that has been posted. So, isse kya hoga? There will be a chilling effect. Obviously, these entities would fear that if we post this sort of content, if we don't keep the establishment happy, then they can come after us in multiple ways. So they will self censor and they will just keep deleting comments and posts, etc., that users might post which could be critical of the government, right? So this can have direct impact on right to free speech. So the constitution allows us free speech, however there are certain restrictions. Like free speech in India is not as free speech in probably the US. There are certain restrictions. If you don't comply with these restrictions, then you don't have free speech, but you generally have, like, speech is free enough. However, that is constitutionally speaking, up court jaoge usme, etc. Now social media intermediaries would now decide automatically how much free speech they want to give you, right? So this is a sort of problem that you might face. So these are basic concerns that I have, not I, people generally have with the guidelines for your OTT platform, sorry, social media intermediaries. Now, iske baad there are separate provision for digital media and OTT platforms. Okay. Now this, so one second. So if you look at the rules that are addressed to digital media, news houses, etc., and OTT platforms in particular, these are little mild. ये बोलते हैं कि हम एक सॉफ्ट टच सेल्फ रेगुलेटरी मैकेनिज्म बनाएंगे एंड विल गिव आउट अ कोड ऑफ कंडक्ट एंड विल पुट इन अ 3-tier grievance redressal mechanism for news publishers and OTT platforms functioning via digital media. Okay. Now these have been also notified under Section 87 of the IT Act. Okay. Now let's look at the first thing, which is the code of ethics. तो ये unenforceable है, इस पे कोई punishment नहीं दिया जाएगा, but generally these are guidelines that OTT platform should abide by. पहला है, they have to classify content into age-based categories: universal adult, 7+, 13+, 16+, or adult content, right? Now they have to implement parental lock for content which is 13+ or higher, right? So there are certain content जिसमें sexual nature के act हो सकते हैं, nudity हो सकता है, या violence या drug use हो सकता है. So obviously you don't want young children to see this and become like, and because they're impressionable, right? You don't want them to imbibe certain wrong things. So uske liye, if you have a content which is classified as 13+, then these OTT platforms should ensure verifiable mechanism jahan pe ek to aap watch viewer ki age check kar sako, and साथ ही साथ you need to have proper parental control mechanisms, etc. Okay. Now, the OTT platforms, obviously, then the guidelines are should not publish any content which is probably prohibited by any court or any law. They should consider that India is a multiracial, multi-religious society. ऐसा कोई content free speech के नाम पे they should not post which might have communal implications and it can lead to law and order problems in writing, etc. Then similarly, there are certain content which might be derogatory to the sovereignty and integrity of India. It might not bide well with the national security or security of the state. So it's basically said that the OTT platform should be weary of this sort of a content. They should not encourage this sort of content. So वो प्यार मोहब्बत से state बोल रहा है basically कि देख लो अपने आराम से प्यार से. Right now we are not imposing something very strict. We are not putting out rules like we are putting out rules for social media. यहाँ पे it's a code of ethics. अभी थोड़ा सा informal setting में है that you yourself develop certain ways to prevent, as in you yourself develop certain mechanisms to prevent objectionable content being shown on your platform. Okay. Now, then they also set up a 3-tier grievance redressal mechanism. First one is self-regulation by the publishers. अगर आप एक पब्लिशर हो ऑफ विच मीन देयर चैनल और समथिंग और ओवर ओटीटी, आप खुद का एक ग्रीवेंस रिड्रेसल ऑफिसर अपॉइंट करो जो इंडिया में रहता है, एंड ही विल टेक डिसीजन ऑन एवरी ग्रीवेंस विद इन 15 days. Second is self-regulation by self-regulating bodies of the publisher. So publishers can either have one officer at the at first level, and any appeal to any of the decision of that officer goes to a self-regulating body that is set up by these publishers. Okay, so एक या एक से ज्यादा bodies हो सकती हैं. There are certain requirements for these bodies. Now these second tier of grievance redressal bodies, your self-regulating bodies, they have to be headed by either a retired judge of the Supreme Court or the High Court, और एनी इंडिपेंडेंट एमिनेंट पर्सन, मतलब एक बड़ा आदमी जिसकी सोशल स्टैंडिंग हो वो होना चाहिए, एंड दे शुड नॉट हैव मोर देन 6 members. This also has to be obviously registered with the Information and Broadcasting Ministry, and its primary purpose will be to make sure that the code of ethics is generally being adhered to, and all grievances that have not been resolved by the publishers under the level 1 mechanism, then they would be resolved within 50 days, then they will be resolved under the tier 2 mechanism. Now let's say tier 1 also fails, that is self-regulation. Tier 2, which is self-regulation, again also fails. That is when you will have an oversight mechanism, and that is when the government will come in. So 1-1.5 महीने का आपको ठीक ठाक टाइम दिया जाएगा to settle all these issues. If you fail at both these levels, it's only then that the Information Broadcasting Ministry will step in with an oversight mechanism. So first, this oversight mechanism has all the power to issue any directions to publishers for maintenance and adherence to code of ethics, right? इससे पहले के जो mechanisms हैं वो सिर्फ suggestions देंगे. जब भारत सरकार एंटर करेगी फिर वो suggestion नहीं देगी, वो डायरेक्टली ऑर्डर देंगे और आपको मानना पड़ेगा. ठीक है, सरकार है मतलब ऑर्डर ही देते हैं. ओके, देन it has the power to establish an interdepartmental committee for grievance hearing. Basically आपको कोई warning देनी है, कोई apology tender करानी है, etc. So you can, it has the power to form a committee within any concerned department, right? So it has overarching power. Government of India है, right? Like when government of India comes in to regulate, then you can't really put in a lot of limitations on them, right? So this is the third tier where you have an oversight mechanism. Okay, now let's look at a couple of other interesting provisions, and that's pretty much it for today. बहुत ज़्यादा लंबी चल गई वीडियो. Okay. Now, so these provisions also say that ठीक है, grievance redressal mechanism है, 15-day time period है, 30-day time period है, all of that exists. But obviously there could be certain information that needs to be blocked on an emergency basis, right? So herein, any authorized officer of the government or any agency, etc., can examine if it is necessary and justifiable to block any sort of a content, and this can be blocked in the case of an emergency. इसमें वो 15-day limit नहीं है. As soon as the order is given to the platform, those platforms have to block this content. Okay. Now this content obviously is the sort of content that can be blocked only under the subsection, under the provision of Sector 69A. So if you read Section 69A, government has the power to issue directions for blocking public access of any information. Okay, now this will only be blocked if the content is prejudicial to the sovereignty and integrity of India, defense of India, security of state, friendly relations with foreign states, or public order. So ये जो term है public order, this is very wide. So anything which is offensive to a section of people can be interpreted to mean that this is disastrous for public order because दंगे हो जाएंगे, right? ठीक है, or for preventing any sort of incitement to commit any of those acts that have been mentioned above. So, right, this is a very broad provision. Now, obviously, there are benefits to it as well. Just say, for example, let's say there is a Chinese movie that is being broadcast on your Amazon Prime or whatever, right? And that Chinese movie is showing a map where Kashmir and Aksai Chin is a part of China. Now, obviously, the government of India will not be happy with it, and it can authorize any emergency action, and that sort particular content can be blocked. So इस type की चीजें हो सकती हैं, which is great. However, then, so the problem with public order is that, let's say there is a documentary on some religion, or there is a documentary about something that might be bad in a particular religion, right? No religion is perfect. Every religion has its own problems. So there could be certain well-meaning documentaries which highlight the problems of particular religions, right? So that is free speech, right? Because it is substantially true and people deserve the right to know what is wrong with their particular religion or somebody else's religion. However, the government might fear that लोगों को समझ नहीं आएगा और उनकी भावनाएं hurt हो सकती हैं. So they might end up curbing the free speech of those producers, etc., to give out this sort of information in the public. So that is one of the concerns also with these regulations, that state आके intervene कर सकता है. And now this will become a fight between public order and safety of every individual versus privacy. So now the state will have to balance private privacy vis-a-vis public interest, and it depends from time to time. Situation कैसी चल रही है, क्या देश में माहौल tense है, etc. All of these things will be a factor while deciding what has to be blocked or not. Okay. Now, another thing is that so there are provisions vis-a-vis publisher of news and current affairs content and publication of online curated content, right? So they have to give the Information and Broadcasting Ministry all the details of these entities. Now, there is one small problem here vis-a-vis how these publisher of news and current affair contents are defined, right? So these people are defined as people who have significant online presence, but they don't have presence on newspapers, etc. So ab isme problem kya hai? So there could be a lot of large news houses, right? Because news is also business today. So there could be a lot of large news houses which have their media channels, which have their YouTube channels, but they also have newspapers, etc. So they can probably get rid of the compliance requirements under these provisions by saying that we also have newspapers, and newspapers are regulated separately under the Press Act, etc. Okay, the Press Council of India regulates newspapers separately. So therefore, they can escape these compliance requirements. The primary target of these provisions could be your new YouTube channels that have come up, right? And interestingly, what has been happening is, like, I don't, as in you're alive, right? So I don't have to comment on the state of mainstream media nowadays, right? Mainstream media is failing to do its job, and a lot of your proper reporting, which is critical of the government, as it should be if the government has failed in certain spheres, is being done by a lot of these YouTube channels, and these videos are then being circulated, etc. So it is one of the concerns with these provisions is that the government might use these rules to curb these YouTube channels and put unnecessarily compliance cost on these YouTube channels. और ये छोटे मोटे YouTube channels हैं, these people don't have the production money of a Z News or an NDTV or a Republic TV, and they will not be able to meet the challenges of this onslaught by the government, and they will have to shut down, right? So these are the sort of issues that we are facing with these rules. And this is pretty much that I had to discuss with these rules. Please, I will share these slides with Pratikesh. He will share it with you. This is all that you need to know about these provisions. Baki are theoretical questions like right to free speech, etc. वो आपको objective type paper है, so you will not be asked those questions, right? So for the scope of your exam, this is enough. If anyone has any doubts, let me know. Otherwise, we are done for today. Kushpreet says no doubts. Okay, I mean, you don't have to type that. I was assuming that if nobody says anything, then you don't have doubts. Okay, cool. So I guess that's it. See you guys. Bye bye.